Good evening. This is John Milburn for PROP13001 Property Development. We're into week 6, and tonight we're covering material from weeks 5 and 6. So the material from week 5 relates to property cycles and week 6 planning. So you have your study guides in relation to both those weeks. At this stage, I've uploaded the formal lecture for week 5. The formal lecture for week 6 is completed, but will be uploaded this evening. So thank you, Johan and Laura, for joining us this evening. Before we start, do you have either of you have any questions, comments? You both going okay with the assessment piece? All good?
Yeah, thank you.
All right, good. Thank you. All right, so what do we make out of property cycles? So without repeating what's in the formal lecture, it's clear that the author of your text says that you need knowledge, and knowledge is power, and also I take from it that you need to have a plan, and you need to have a plan of attack in relation to what the property cycles may do to your property development. And really it comes down to planning and, to some degree, to be honest, guesswork. In other words, if everyone knew what the property cycles were with accuracy, then they wouldn't be property cycles that are worthy of comment. They'd just be public information. We work around it. So there's a degree of guesswork, but what we need to do in the context of property development and planning for the property development is consider the likely duration of a property cycle, consider the accuracy of the information that you have, and trying to determine what is likely to come about as a result of the property cycle. So in the study guide, the first thing is to understand what is a property cycle. So in your assessment piece, when you're dealing with planning for a property development, I think you'd need to factor in something about property cycles. I think you'd need to at least acknowledge that they exist and that you've got some degree of planning associated with it. So what do you think is the first item of planning associated with having a property cycle? Again, we've only got 2 of you here, so I'm not going to pick on you, and you don't have to answer. But if you'd like to contribute, that's great. It'll just save me talking all the time. What's the first thing we need to do if we're going to be talking, if we talk about property cycles in our assessment? What do you think we'll have to talk about? I guess we'd say, well, here's what it is and they exist. They can be different types, they can be of different duration and intensity, but that's all very well, but what practical steps can we do to take into account the effect of property cycles and deal with it in that way? The hint is the first line in the assessment: knowledge is power. So we need to have some knowledge about property cycles. Where do we acquire that knowledge? Any thoughts? Yes,
yes, some market research.
Okay.
Yeah.
So market research, says Johan. That's very good. Laura, what do you think?
Experience.
Experience, yeah. And what if you don't have the experience? What if this is your first property development?
I try to, work with people that do have the knowledge.
Yes, networking is very important. So thank you very much. I agree with both those contributions. What about formal sources of information that might be relevant to assist with property development, property cycles rather? Can you think of any formal avenues of obtaining information?
Institutions like the Australian Property Institute, they've got market outlooks.
Maybe sales data of like the area.
Yes, absolutely. And a lot of valuers put out some excellent material that provides you with information about historic information, which provides a good basis for projecting into the future. Now, what about CoreLogic RP data? Either of you had any association with that through the REIQ?
Yes, I use that on a daily basis.
Okay, yes, all right. So do you find that, and Johan, you're a valuer, or you work in the valuation industry, and Laura, you're in real estate, do you find that information assists you in trying to learn something about property cycles?
Yes, I feel it does.
Okay. And it's always a danger, of course, to necessarily simply project what has happened in the past to be into the future. It doesn't work as neatly as that, but there are those strategies. Okay, so given that knowledge is power, that's great. We've identified some sources of where we might obtain the knowledge. The next thing is, what strategies might we adopt as a property developer in dealing with property cycles? There are two very clear strategies that I've got in mind that I would promote. But what do you think? Are there any strategies that we can adopt, apart from understanding that property cycles exist, understand the need for knowledge through extraneous material or experience? What do we then do with that knowledge is really my point. Any thoughts? In order to help give you an idea of what I'm getting at, I'm going to refer back to a comment made by your author. At 5.5, Reed and Sims say this: every successful property developer has a formal plan for surviving a major market downturn and prospering on the other side of the cycle during the upturn. The key is timing. Okay, so given that if we accept that as being true, that every successful property developer has a formal plan, it would seem to me that under the heading of property cycles, apart from identifying what it is and trying to give some indication of where you would find information about it, the next step, the practical step, is to develop a formal plan for survival. It's all very well to say that, but what does it actually mean? Hi, Monica. Good to see you've joined us. We're just talking about property cycles, and we're trying to identify what it is that a property developer can do in a formal plan to survive a major market downturn. Gosh, what do you do? Any thoughts? What about this? What about, I'm just going to mute your microphone, Monica, unless you're ready to talk. What about we go back to cash flow projections, and we try to take a best case scenario, a worst case scenario approach. That's part of a survival plan, isn't it? And then trying to assess as best you can the probability of where the property cycle will be and the intensity of it. In other words, I would have thought that part of your formal plan for survival is to project based on different scenarios over periods of time. Of course, the extent and time associated with your property development will have a bearing on that. What else can we do apart from developing alternate cash flow projections? Any other thoughts? What would a successful property developer do to take into account property cycles? Maybe have a contingency plan to say, well, if something is looking bad, here's the contingency plan. It may be the worst case scenario, but rather than think about it at the time when you're under stress, at least be able to push the red button to say this is the plan we're going to do in case we have a major market downturn. Now, it may be that part of the plan is to segregate assets that are private assets before you go into the property development to try to minimise the potential for loss of the family home, for example. That might be part of a property plan that deals with major downturns in a property cycle. What else can you do as a property developer? Well, depending on the nature of the development, it may be that you can associate yourself with pre-sales or pre-leasing. In the study guides, I've referred to the Land Sales Act 1984 Queensland, which deals with what I've called flat land subdivisions. And in relation to those developments that involve a body corporate, the Body Corporate and Community Management Act, which deals with community title scheme lots. So as a property developer, as part of your plan for dealing with property cycles, do you think you would consider attempting to sell some or all of your development off the plan? And if so, what are the legal requirements that regulate those sales? Those of you involved in the real estate industry probably know what this is all about, but it's not difficult, but there are steps that must be considered and done properly, and failure to do it may mean that contracts that were signed 12 months ago suddenly fall over because of failure to comply with legal requirements. So it is important that you consider those legal requirements at the start. So I would have thought that these are all sorts of things that you'd consider as part of a prudent developer trying to create some sort of plan or even buffer against unexpected falls in the market. So having pre-sales or pre-leasing might be a good way of doing that. Now, can I pose this question? And I think it's one that's in the study guide. As a property developer, would you like to conceptually, and I'm not sure there's a right or wrong answer to this, but would you like to have all of the property sold, even if it's sold at a cheap rate, or would you like to have half the property sold at a cheap rate? Are there pros and cons with either plan? Does it depend on your individual risk perspective? Does it depend on how much capital you've got in reserve? So these are strategies that you'd need to consider and be in a position to argue for one way or the other and have it recorded. I guess in many ways what we're talking about is crystal balling. We're talking about what might happen, but more importantly, what are you going to do and where are you going to find the information to deal with these property cycles? And it's really all a question of a function of risk. Now, does anyone have any questions, comments? Feel free to disagree with me if you think that there's a different approach, if you think that there's a different way to look at this. All right, so have a look at the review questions in the study guide. The first question, which deals with knowledge is power, talks about the fact that a successful property developer must acquire knowledge to survive and prosper, and it's important that you undertake some way of finding information that you can use that goes directly to the first assessment. Then there's issues to do with property cycles, contingency plans, and the sale and leasing of lots yet to be developed. Have a look at 5.4, which calls upon you to consider why developers may consider pre-selling or pre-leasing lots in a property development and how that might be used as a buffer against adverse property cycles. Unless there's any questions or comments, that's all I propose to talk about in relation to week 5 material. All good? We're racing through. Right, let's talk about week 6 planning material. I will upload the formal lecture this evening in relation to it. So I'm not going to cover what's in that formal lecture, but it's a meaty topic. You'll need to look at a couple of pieces of legislation. In week 5, it was the Land Sales Act and the BC and the Body Corporate and Community Management Act. In week 6, the key pieces of legislation, the Planning Act, Queensland, which is the most important, and from a Commonwealth perspective, the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, the EPBCA. In the Planning Act, have a look at the regulations, and really importantly, have a look at some material on the Queensland planning system. You'll find it on the web page, and that information is terrific because it provides great information about development plans. Also, when you're considering the legislation and you want to understand why the material is there, you can always consider the explanatory notes. The explanatory notes or explanatory memorandum is material that's provided at the time that the legislation is introduced and passed to explain its purpose, and it provides detail about the purpose for individual sections within the Act. So it can be a really useful process. Now, I was, what I might do is just share the screen now and show you the web page that I I'm considering. Won't be a sec. Just share the screen. While I'm doing that, any questions, comments? All good? All right, so hopefully you can see now the Queensland Planning System webpage. If you can't, please just let me know. Have a look at the online tools and services, and you'll find the different materials are interactive and very useful. Now this has changed since I last saw it, but you can see that you can map your property development application. So it's a really good way of understanding the approval process by using these online tools, and ultimately you can produce a flowchart to map your individual development process. You'll see in the study guide that I've just given you a sample of something, and this is from where it's drawn. And it's a matter of just answering some of these questions. So is your proposal accepted or approved development or prohibited development? Let's say no. Is the application to be publicly notified? Let's say yes. I'm just doing this at random now. Will it involve referral to a referral agency? Let's say yes. Are you intending to elect not to receive an information request? No. Is the application likely to involve an information request? Yes. And we'll look at the flowchart. Now, of course, this only makes sense within the context of a real application for development, such as a development which is part commercial, part residential, for example, if you understand the questions. And in order to understand the questions, you need to go to the source of the material for the questions, which essentially means looking at the Planning Act 2016. What this does is provide you with information about the process. And you'll see here for this impact accessible development application, there is involvement of referral, information request and public notification. And on the left-hand side, you'll see the various parts. So there are four parts to this development with 5 parts. And part 3, which is the information request, is contained within the bounds of part 5. So the application, the referral, the public notification, the decision, and in amongst that is the information request. And that's as you work down the page vertically. If you look horizontally, you'll see the time periods. So up the top, you'll see a reference to 10 business days, then 20 business days, then 5 business days as part of the initial process. So I would work your way through that, and I would suggest that it's likely that if you were preparing, for example, your procedure for undertaking a property development, that you would need to have an appropriate flowchart as part of that process. Now, has anyone had a chance to look at those flowcharts? Have you actually worked with them in the past, or do you work with them currently? Does anyone want to make any comments about those flowcharts or the terminology involved? Or is it all good? I like that because it's interactive, and it's a great way of learning about it, because as you have to answer a question, it prompts you to go back primarily to the legislation and provide a response. Now, what you will see in the study guide this week, it departs considerably from the material in your text. The material in the text is very good, but it's not localised to Queensland, so the study guides are much more important in this week than they would be other weeks, where they largely reflect the content of your textbook. And in order to learn the subject properly, you do need to go beyond the study guide. The reference text is Bates, which is Environmental Law in Australia. It's a very good text, but it's huge. And I don't necessarily recommend that you go and buy these supplementary texts because they're very expensive. You can if you wish. if you're working in the industry, they're well worth the investment. But in order to get through the this unit, and in particular your first assessment, I would refer primarily to the study guides and look at the links and the material that I've referred to. In terms of terminology, you'll see that when you're applying for a development, you need to understand a few basics. You need to understand whether this is a development that requires special approval. Is it an impact accessible development? Is it a code accessible development? Hi, Ellen. Thanks for joining us. You need to understand that terminology and get an idea of when it applies, when it doesn't apply. You'll need to understand who is the decision maker. Well, it's the assessment manager primarily, and the assessment manager is someone designated from the council to make the decision. But the assessment manager may bring in referral agencies to make an assessment, and those referral agencies, which act as concurrent agencies, will also consider the matter, but from their individual, if you like, specialised perspective, and they can impose conditions, or they can reject the application as well as the assessment manager. So the assessment manager is the key, but referral agencies will also play a part in many applications. So in the example that I showed you through the flowchart, you'll see that I introduced referral agencies as part of the process. You'll need to consider within the context of a property development that you're determining whether referral agencies are likely to be relevant to the development process. So when the development goes through, it's being assessed, you need to understand what it's being assessed against. So what does what does an assessment manager consider a development against? Does the development assessment managers look at it and think, well, it looks all right? I like the colours. Yes, Johan?
I'd say the local planning policies.
Yes, absolutely. Yep. So we need to know where to find these local planning policies. Anything else?
Would zoning be included in that?
Absolutely.
Especially with councils, they have different zoning where different developments can occur.
Yes, absolutely. So as part of your first assessment, I would think that in order to explain the process of developing the property, you need to identify the need for considering the zoning. You'll need to identify how you find that zoning, make it relevant to you. Like if you're not in Queensland, feel free to make it within your state so that it actually is a workable document for you. But you'll need to find out what the zoning is. What happens if you find that the land that you wish to acquire is not zoned in an appropriate manner? Is that the end of it? Or are there things you can do? Yes, you have.
Sorry, Ellen, you go.
I came across this in the assignment because I've already done this part where I looked at 2 bits of land and the one was zoned correctly where the other wasn't. So I contacted council and they just let me know the processes of how to get it rezoned, the rough costs and the time. So it takes about 2 years to put an application through to be rezoned, if that makes sense. And then
Absolutely.
It costs about $100,000. It's really expensive. So it's better off that you find somewhere that's already zoned to what you're looking to develop.
Or is it? Now, I just wonder, look, I hear what you say, Ellen, but just playing devil's advocate for a moment, can anyone think of a reason why you, as a property developer, might actually look for property that is not the right zoning, but you've got a feeling that you can make it the right zoning by going through the process? Ellen says, look for property that is zoned correctly already. Is there an argument to go for the other way? Yes, Laura?
You could probably get it by a cheaper price.
Yes. So if it costs $100,000 to redevelop it, maybe you could get it for $100,000 cheaper. Maybe you can get it even cheaper than that. because of the risk associated with the property development and the rezoning process? I mean, it's a punt, but I wonder if it's a strategy. I wonder also, and I'm not suggesting this is the way to go. I'm just purely presenting an alternate approach that you might consider as a property developer. The fact that it's taking much longer, is that a good thing or a bad thing for a property developer? What do you think?
Okay, I'm going to take a punt and say, well, roughly developments take 12-ish months to build and get ready to sell off and whatnot. And depending on how many, as a developer, depending on how many other projects you have in the making and their time restraints, I'd probably say the quicker the better. Like, you're getting it done. That makes sense. Because then, and not only that, if you've got finance on it, that's longer that your finance is going to sit there. You know, you've got to pay interest on that finance, and it's tying up your money for a long time. Whereas if it's done efficiently and quickly, then you can sell it off. You've made some money, move on to your next development, etc.
And look, I think there's a lot to be said for that. And that's probably the case that you would adopt mostly as a property developer, but looking at it a different perspective, maybe you would like to secure land at today's price, even though you don't necessarily have to pay for it all until the rezoning has gone through, and pay for it in 3 years' time or 2 years' time. So perhaps there's that argument as well, that particularly if you've got other things that you're doing with your development in the meantime, you can have this one sit. And if you buy the land at the right price, it may be that deferring it is an appropriate strategy. There's no right or wrong answer here. I think you're probably right, Ellen. I think most developers would rather get in, develop it, make the money work for them quickly. But I'm just suggesting that it's not something that you should, the wrong zoning is not something that should necessarily dissuade you immediately. I think you've got to consider it as part of your strategy, is really the point that I'm making. But in order to do that, you need to understand the process. So thank you, Ellen. Are there any other thoughts on the issue of planning and how it might be relevant to property development applications? Okay, let's look at another aspect. Would you consider pre-sales? Would you consider selling, say, land or units off the plan? What are the thoughts? Are there any pros or cons for that approach?
Yeah, I think there's both pros and cons, depending, first of all, on if you understand the property cycle, and prior to your development, you sell something off plan at near the peak of the property cycle. By the time it's completed, obviously it might have been a fall in value, but you've secured it at a high price.
Yes. And I think that's great. Thank you, Johan. If, as a property developer, you're marketing something for sale off the plan, then presumably part of your marketing strategy is to say, look, secure the property now at today's prices, and you don't have to pay for it for 12 months or 18 months until we develop it. So what you're doing is you're using the fact that people can defer their payment as an advantage to them. Now, logically, if it's an advantage to the buyer, then it would be a disadvantage to you, but not necessarily, because it might assist you in securing finance. And it may be that your financier says, we'll be interested in financing this application, but only if you have 30% pre-sales, for example. So you'd need to understand your financing requirements. You'd need to understand what your financier is likely to say, and to make an informed decision as to whether you're prepared to sell some lots on that basis in order to secure finance, even though it may be that the buyers who buy those off-the-plan units ultimately pay less for those units than those people who wait until the completed project is there. By then, the prices may have gone up. Does that make sense? Now, has anyone done any work in terms of identifying what financiers might likely want from a developer in terms of pre-sales or pre-leasing?
I contacted a couple of banks, and they didn't really, because I asked about whether, I gave them the scenario, and they pretty much said that they would go off depending on how you're loaning, if you're loaning against your personal assets or a development asset, like from your business. So they weren't overly fussed about selling off the plan. But when I was doing my toolkit, I kind of put in that it might be something I could do to help pay off the loan and my creditors more efficiently, so then in the long run I'm making more money.
So it's a strategy. Now, thank you very much, Ellen. So that's in a situation where you're developing the property to sell. What if you're developing the property to keep, or to keep for a short period of time and then sell it as you like, a going concern? So let's say an office building with 20 commercial tenancies. Do you want pre-leasing, or do you want to wait until it's completed? And what are some of the general strategies that a property developer may have to consider when it comes to leasing property, vacant property? Any thoughts? What about lease incentives? Anyone come across that? What about the duration of the lease? As a property developer, do you want someone to sign a lease for 12 months, 3 years, or 20 years? These are the sorts of things that I think you'd need to consider if you're developing the property with a view to having it let, either to keep in the long term for yourself or to sell to others. It's very common, in my experience, for lease incentives to be made available, and then it's a trade-off as to how much what you provide by way of an incentive against the rent that you receive. As a property developer, would you rather pay a substantial rent incentive in cash or in kind, by paying for a fit out, for example, in order to secure a higher per square metre rental rate? Or would you rather pay no incentive and have a lower per square metre rental rate? If so, why? And would that have any bearing on the capitalisation rate and the ultimate value of your building? Yes, Laura? Oh, Laura has to go. Okay, sorry, Laura. Thank you. Now, does anyone have any thoughts on what you might do? Would you rather have the lower rate with no lease incentive, or the higher lease incentive and the higher rate? There's no right or wrong answer.
I'd go for the higher rate, especially if you're looking at a longer term lease. I mean, the lease incentive is obviously a one-off, and if it's capitalised over a period of time, you'll be better off with a longer lease at higher rate.
I would have thought so. And ultimately, how does that have a bearing on capitalisation rates and the value of the completed development?
Yeah, it'll increase the value because you're standing a better return is waiting for, even if you have to sell it, the new property owner has got a longer lease at a higher rate.
Yeah, so the theory would be that although the property developer loses a substantial sum by way of the lease incentive at the outset, the property developer more than makes up for that in the capitalised value of the completed development, based on the rate of return to the investor that might consider buying the whole thing at a later time. Okay, so again, there's no right or wrong answers, but these are just matters that you might consider. Okay, other than that, you'll see in the notes that there's some reference to ministerial call-ins, state planning policy, regional plans, and local plans, and a smattering of cases from the Planning and Environment Court, which deal with issues of either a rejection of an application or an approval of an application on conditions that are unsatisfactory to a developer. And some of the cases relate to submitter or objectors' appeals against decisions, and some relate to contravention matters. Again, when you're considering the reading, look carefully at the study guide questions, try to answer the review questions, and answer those tutorial problems. Ideally, what you'd do is put some answers on Moodle, the scope for you to do that, or at least prepare answers to each of them. So you shouldn't leave the week until you're in a position where you've written some answers to each of those problems, and that'll give you a good idea as to whether you can understand the process. If you're struggling to answer the problems, please ask through UCrew so we can open up some discussions, or have some questions available for our online sessions each week. Okay, so I think that's it for tonight, unless there are any comments, questions. Sorry you missed a fair part of it, Ellen, but it is all recorded, so you can check that out later. And I think, Monica, you missed the start as well.
Yeah, I forgot about the time zone difference because I'm in SA, so daylight savings is just finished, and it's like yes. I completely forgot. Very
confusing. All right. Okay, well, thank you again for joining us. I'll end the meeting now. I'll upload this session and I'll upload the formal lecture, hopefully both tonight. All the best, and we'll see you next week. Bye then.
Thanks, bye.
Bye.